Emma's morning began like any other, but something in the air felt off. The sunlight slanted through the kitchen windows in an ordinary way, but as she moved across the floor, she noticed the subtle differences. The cushion that had been neatly stacked yesterday lay slightly askew. The rug near the door seemed moved. At first, she tried to shrug it off, telling herself she was imagining things. She was tired, and maybe exhaustion was making her notice things more intensely than usual. But when she walked into the living room and spotted a mug on the coffee table, her heart skipped a beat. It wasn't her mug. It wasn't Daniel's. It was warm. Someone had been here recently. Someone had been inside their home. A place Emma always considered her sanctuary. Her mind raced, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe Daniel had left it. But he hadn't. They had both been gone the previous evening, attending a small dinner with friends, leaving the house empty for hours. She knew this because they had texted each other while away. The warmth of the mug was a silent, unwelcome confirmation. Her stomach knotted. The walls that should have made her feel safe suddenly seemed like barriers that could be crossed by anyone. The sense of security she had taken for granted all her life had evaporated. Emma's first instinct was denial. Perhaps she was overreacting. Maybe it was a trick of the mind or her imagination playing games. But the mug, the slightly moved items, the feeling of a presence in her home, they didn't lie. Her heart beat faster, anxiety rising with each thought. She remembered that only 3 people had keys to their house: herself, Daniel, and Margaret, her mother-in-law. Margaret had always presented herself as a caring, doting figure in their lives, a woman who loved her son fiercely. That she also had a reputation for being overbearing and controlling. Emma had known it, seen it in subtle ways. The pointed comments, disguised as advice, the faint disapproval in her eyes during family visits, the quiet judgment she felt in her mother-in-law's presence. Yet Emma had always tolerated it, often forcing herself to ignore the unease she felt, reminding herself it was just Margaret's way of showing concern. Now, standing in the living room with the warm mug in her hand, Emma realized that Margaret had crossed an invisible line. She had entered their home without permission. She had ignored boundaries. What was supposed to be a gesture of trust, the spare key given to her in case of emergencies, had been turned into a tool of intrusion. The betrayal cut deep. It wasn't just about the physical act of entering the house. It was about respect, about trust, about the assumption that Emma's life, her space, her privacy, didn't matter. It was personal. It was intimate. When Daniel returned home later that evening, Emma confronted him. Her words trembled despite her determination, fueled by the anger and confusion swirling in her chest. She explained what she had discovered, how the mug had been left out, how she had noticed small changes around the house. Daniel listened, but his reaction frustrated her. He hesitated, fidgeted with his hands, tried to explain it away as something innocent. "She only comes by to check in," he said finally. "She worries about us, that's all." But Emma's trust in him faltered in that moment. It wasn't about whether Margaret cared. It was about respect. Margaret had ignored the boundaries they had set together. Daniel's casual dismissal of the problem made it worse. He wanted peace, convenience, a smooth resolution. But Emma wanted justice. She wanted recognition that what had been done was wrong. The confrontation left Emma shaken. That night she lay awake, her mind spinning. She recalled all the times she had felt uncomfortable in Margaret's presence, the subtle invasions of her space, the judgments and criticisms that had piled up over the years. Each memory compounded her feelings of violation. She realized that this incident wasn't an isolated moment. It was a continuation of a pattern. Margaret had always sought control, and now she had acted openly, brazenly, entering a space that didn't belong to her. The betrayal was tangible. It wasn't theoretical anymore. It was present in her home, in the warmth of a mug, in the shifted cushions, in the silence of rooms that had felt familiar and safe only moments before. As Emma processed the betrayal, a sense of determination began to rise inside her. She wasn't someone who sought confrontation lightly. She wasn't the type to yell, argue, or make scenes. But something had changed. Her perception of Margaret, the woman she had tolerated, and perhaps even liked in small doses, had shifted irrevocably. Emma felt a spark of defiance, a quiet but powerful insistence that she would not allow this to happen again. The idea of revenge, of reclaiming control over her life, her home, and her dignity, began to take root. She started planning in her mind. It wasn't about causing harm for the sake of harm. It was about re-establishing boundaries. It was about sending a message without speaking a word. The thought of changing the locks flickered in her mind like a sudden, electric impulse. It was a practical solution, a symbolic act of taking back her power. It was decisive. It was controlled. And it was hers alone to execute. Emma imagined the scenario repeatedly. Margaret coming over, expecting the usual access, only to find doors she could no longer open. She pictured the confusion, the surprise, perhaps even the anger on her mother-in-law's face. And for the first time, Emma felt a sense of anticipation that wasn't rooted in fear or anxiety. It was a strange mix of satisfaction and empowerment. The thought of taking action, of reclaiming control, gave her a sense of clarity she hadn't felt since the mug had revealed the truth. But alongside this sense of empowerment, a deeper, more conflicted emotion surfaced. Guilt. Did she have the right to do this? Was it too extreme? She wrestled with the moral implications, her mind going back and forth. On one hand, she wanted to feel safe, respected, and unviolated. On the other, she didn't want to create permanent damage within the family. She questioned whether this act of defiance would permanently sever her relationship with Daniel's mother, or if it would simply teach a lesson she hoped Margaret would understand. As the night deepened, Emma's emotions grew more intense. She felt hurt, anger, fear, and determination all at once. She realized that she had been underestimating the psychological toll of Margaret's intrusion. It wasn't just an act of carelessness. It was an assertion of dominance. Margaret had entered her space, disregarded her autonomy, and assumed control over what was Emma's own life. The betrayal was multi-layered. It attacked Emma's sense of security, her trust in her husband, and her perception of her own strength. The following day, Emma walked through the house with heightened awareness. Every object, every corner, every room was a reminder of her vulnerability. She examined the locks on the doors, the windows, the spare key she had entrusted to Margaret years ago. Each detail became a focal point of her thoughts. The sense of being violated lingered like a shadow. She realized that the house was no longer a place of comfort. It had become a battlefield, a stage for the quiet war between autonomy and intrusion. Emma's resolve solidified. She would not allow this to continue. The warmth of the mug was more than a momentary disturbance. It was a symbol of everything she would no longer tolerate. She began to envision the steps she would take, the sequence of actions that would restore her sense of safety and dignity. She would change the locks. She would draw boundaries. She would make it impossible for Margaret to enter without consent. And she would do so not out of spite, but out of necessity. By the time Daniel returned that evening, Emma had already made up her mind. She could see the tension in his face. The way he sensed something was different, though he couldn't yet name it. When she spoke, her voice was steady, controlled. She told him what she had discovered, how she had thought about it, and the decision she was leaning toward. Daniel hesitated, unsure, torn between his love for his mother and his support for his wife. Emma understood his dilemma, but she could not let it sway her. The choice was hers. The safety of her home, the sanctity of her personal space, and her own peace of mind rested in her hands. That night, as Emma lay in bed, she felt a strange combination of fear, determination, and a hint of exhilaration. She knew that changing the locks would be more than a practical step. It would be a statement. It would assert her boundaries without a word spoken. It would protect her home and, in a way, reclaim a piece of her dignity. But she also knew that this act would have consequences, rippling through relationships in ways she could not yet predict. And as she drifted into a restless sleep, the first seeds of a new plan began to grow in her mind. It was quiet, methodical, and deliberate. She would not act in anger, but in purpose. She would reclaim her home. She would reclaim her life. And Margaret, she realized, would have to face the reality of the choices she had made. The morning sun rose again, and with it, Emma's resolve hardened. The betrayal had been clear. The mug had been a messenger, and the path forward was hers to carve. After the betrayal, Emma's days blurred together in a haze of anger, fear, and determination. Each time she entered her living room, her gaze lingered on the places Margaret had touched, the spaces she had invaded. She began noticing things she hadn't before. A crooked picture frame, a chair slightly pushed out of place, the faint scent of perfume lingering in corners where no visitor should have been. Each detail gnawed at her, reminding her that someone had disregarded her boundaries. The violation was no longer abstract. It was visible, tangible, and it festered inside her like a quiet wound. Daniel tried to calm her, but Emma found his reassurances hollow. "She only means well," he said. "She's family." To him, Margaret's actions were just concern, a misguided effort to help. But to Emma, the intrusion was deliberate and invasive. It wasn't care. It was control. And the more Daniel minimized it, the angrier she felt. She wasn't looking for permission to be upset. She wasn't seeking approval. She wanted recognition that what had happened was wrong. She wanted justice. Emma's mind became a constant whirl of what ifs and what now. She imagined Margaret coming over again, unannounced, assuming the same access as before. She imagined confronting her in the moment, letting all her anger loose. She imagined shouting, demanding respect, demanding acknowledgement. But that fantasy left her feeling uneasy. It would be explosive, emotional, and raw. It might bring momentary relief, but it would also create chaos. It might damage relationships permanently, including her connection with Daniel. Instead, a quieter, more strategic thought began to emerge. What if she acted deliberately, without yelling or arguing? What if she could reclaim her home without turning it into a battlefield? The idea of changing the lock surfaced again, but this time it carried weight. It wasn't just a practical step, it was symbolic. It was a way to draw a line, a boundary, an invisible wall that said, "This is mine. You will not cross it without my permission." She began thinking in scenarios. Margaret would arrive expecting access and find herself locked out. She would fumble with keys, perhaps plead, perhaps demand explanations. Emma would remain calm, collected, in control. The act itself would speak louder than words ever could. It was a form of revenge, but controlled, precise, measured. It wasn't about humiliating Margaret. It was about reclaiming power and asserting boundaries. Yet, as the idea grew clearer, Emma felt the weight of moral conflict. Was this too harsh? Would it permanently damage her marriage? Her relationship with Daniel? The family she had tried to protect? She questioned herself repeatedly. But each doubt was countered by the memory of the mug, the evidence of the intrusion. Each memory reminded her why she couldn't ignore it, why she couldn't pretend it hadn't happened. The locks weren't just metal. They were her safety, her autonomy, her dignity manifest. Every day, Emma became more observant, more cautious. She noted when Margaret called, when she mentioned dropping by casually, when she hinted at checking on things at the house. Each instance felt like a test, a probing of boundaries she hadn't yet enforced. Emma realized that Margaret had a pattern, a quiet persistence that Emma had underestimated. This was a woman who felt entitled to her son's life, to his home, and by extension, to Emma's compliance. Recognizing this pattern sharpened Emma's resolve. She wouldn't be manipulated. She wouldn't allow someone else's sense of entitlement to dictate her life. Her preparation became almost ritualistic. She researched locksmiths, compared options, planned times when the work could be done without alerting Margaret. She calculated Daniel's reactions, anticipating his confusion or protest, and considered how she would explain her actions calmly and rationally. Every step was deliberate. She wasn't acting on impulse. She was strategizing, and with every calculated move, her sense of control grew. At the same time, the psychological struggle weighed heavily on her. Revenge is rarely straightforward. The more she plotted, the more Emma felt the emotional cost. She would feel satisfaction, yes, but she also felt an unfamiliar hollowness creeping in. Would she feel powerful or guilty? Would she feel justified or cruel? These thoughts circled endlessly in her mind, each one gnawing at her confidence. The act of revenge, even carefully planned, demanded reflection. It forced her to examine her own motivations, her own desires, and the person she wanted to be. Emma's nights were sleepless, filled with vivid imaginings. She pictured Margaret arriving, fumbling with the door, realizing she had been denied entry. She pictured the confrontation, Margaret's indignation, and her own calm refusal to yield. But she also imagined the fallout, the tension with Daniel, the hurt in his eyes, the potential permanent rift in the family. The fantasies were bittersweet. They gave her a sense of power but also revealed the complexity of the decision. Revenge was not simple. It never was. As the days passed, Emma began to notice the subtle shifts in her own behavior. She was more assertive with Daniel, more cautious with Margaret, more aware of her surroundings. She observed every sound in the house, every movement. Outside the windows, every message on her phone. Her senses were heightened. Every small act by Margaret, a suggestion, a comment, a subtle question about visiting, made her flinch and think ahead. She was calculating, anticipating, preparing. The mental toll was heavy, but she knew it was necessary. She couldn't allow herself to be caught off guard again. Despite the tension, there was a strange satisfaction in the planning. Emma felt alive in a way she hadn't in months. The betrayal had awakened a determination she hadn't known she possessed. She realized that for too long, she had allowed herself to be passive, to accept small invasions and subtle manipulations. Now, she was taking back control, not with anger alone, but with careful thought and deliberate action. Finally, the day came when she decided to act. She called a locksmith and scheduled a discreet appointment for the following morning. She watched the new locks being installed, each turn of the key feeling like a reclaiming of power. When Daniel asked why she had done it, she answered simply and firmly, "I cannot live in a house where I feel unsafe." The words were measured, calm, and absolute. There was no room for argument, no room for negotiation. The act itself spoke volumes. But even as the new locks clicked into place, Emma felt the weight of the choice. She had enacted her revenge, but the emotional cost was real. She felt a mixture of relief, fear, and something like guilt. Margaret's reaction would come eventually, and when it did, it could be explosive. Yet Emma also knew she had taken a necessary step. This was no longer about anger alone. It was about safety, autonomy, and dignity. She had drawn a line, and crossing it again would no longer be possible. In the quiet of the evening, Emma reflected on the psychological journey she had been through. She realized that revenge is never simple. It involves calculation, patience, and often a cold detachment. It requires seeing the situation clearly and understanding the consequences of every action. It demands a balance between justice and cruelty, between empowerment and guilt. For Emma, the act of changing the locks was both revenge and protection, a necessary step to reclaim her life without destroying herself in the process. The days following the lock change were tense. Emma noticed Margaret calling, sending texts, hinting at surprise visits. But she remained calm, silent, and resolute. Every attempt at intrusion was met with the same boundary. The door was locked. There was no access, no negotiation, no compromise. Margaret's frustration grew, and Emma observed it with a careful mixture of satisfaction and wariness. She had created consequences for actions that had once gone unchecked, and she felt the balance of power shifting. Yet, even as the practical side of revenge succeeded, the emotional side was more complicated. Emma wrestled with questions that would not leave her. Had she gone too far? Was this permanent damage, or would it teach Margaret a necessary lesson? Would Daniel resent her for taking such a strong stance? Or would he understand the importance of boundaries? The internal conflict was constant, but Emma reminded herself that safety, respect, and dignity were not negotiable. The act of revenge was not for cruelty. It was for survival. In quiet moments, Emma reflected on her motivations. She realized that her revenge was as much about reclaiming her own strength as it was about punishing Margaret. The violation had awakened something in her, a clarity about what she would tolerate and what she would not. The locks were a tool, a symbol, and a declaration. Her home was hers, and no one would dictate the terms of her life again. And so, Emma waited. She watched, she listened, she observed. Margaret would react, she knew, but when that moment came, Emma would be ready. She had planned, she had strategized, and she had prepared herself for the confrontation that was inevitable. But she also knew that true revenge was not in a single moment of triumph. It was in the quiet assurance that she had taken control, that she had enforced boundaries, and that she would no longer be passive in the face of intrusion. Emma had entered a new phase of her life. She was no longer simply a victim of circumstance or of Margaret's overreach. She was an active participant in defining her own life, setting the rules and reclaiming her autonomy. And while the emotional consequences of her actions would unfold in time, she knew one thing with certainty. She had acted deliberately, with purpose, and on her own terms. The locks were changed. The boundaries were drawn. And Emma had begun the long process of reclaiming not only her home, but her sense of self. The morning Margaret discovered she could no longer enter Emma's house. Her frustration was immediate. She rattled the handle of the front door, the metal clanging against the frame, as if noise alone could undo the change. The sun was high, casting long shadows across the driveway, but Margaret barely noticed. Her face was tight with disbelief, eyes wide as she realized the locks had been changed. She knocked, first politely, then with rising impatience. her voice sharp as she called out, "Emma! Daniel! Open this door." Inside, Emma watched from the window, her chest tight with anticipation, and a strange mix of fear and satisfaction. She had imagined this moment countless times, pacing through the scenarios in her head. Margaret's frustration, her confusion, the sharp questions that would come. All of it had played out in Emma's mind like a detailed script. But now, seeing it unfold in real life, the tension was almost unbearable. Every second Margaret lingered at the door increased Emma's pulse. She felt the culmination of days of planning, the weight of the betrayal that had started this chain reaction, and the power of her decision. Daniel appeared behind her, peering out the window with concern etched across his face. "Emma, she's really angry," he said quietly, almost afraid to breathe. He had known the locks were being changed, but he hadn't anticipated this immediate confrontation. Emma nodded, holding her composure. She had prepared for this. She had rehearsed her words, her demeanor, her calm authority. This was her moment, and she would not falter. Margaret tried the handle again, rattling it with more force this time, but it didn't budge. She took a step back, muttering under her breath, her eyebrows knitting together in a mixture of disbelief and indignation. She raised her voice, sharper now. "Emma, this is ridiculous. I am your family. How could you do this to me?" Emma stepped out onto the porch, letting the door close softly behind her. She met Margaret's gaze steadily. The wind caught her hair. The sunlight highlighted the determined set of her jaw. She was calm, composed, collected, the opposite of the flustered, entitled figure standing across from her. "I changed the locks," she said simply. Her voice was measured, firm, and without malice, but every word carried weight. "This house is mine, my home, and I cannot allow you to enter without my permission." Margaret's face twisted with a mixture of shock and outrage. "Permission? After everything I've done for you for Daniel? You locked me out like a stranger." Her voice wavered, a mix of anger and hurt. For a moment, she seemed taken aback by Emma's calmness. She expected shouting, drama, tears, but Emma offered nothing but steady resolve. Emma felt the tension in the air like a living thing, pressing against her chest. She remembered the mug, the small violations, the creeping sense of intrusion that had built over months and years. Each memory fueled her sense of authority and necessity. "This isn't about punishment," she said, her eyes unwavering. "It's about boundaries. You entered my home without my consent. That is not acceptable. That is not something I can ignore." Margaret's mouth opened as if to argue, then closed. She took a step back, the anger in her eyes still burning, but the realization of the situation beginning to sink in. She was being denied the access she had taken for granted. Emma could see the shock in her mother-in-law's posture, the slight slump in her shoulders, the flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. This was the moment Emma had envisioned. The confrontation, the imbalance of power finally shifting, the clear declaration that boundaries would be respected. And yet, Emma felt a strange emptiness in her chest. She had expected satisfaction, the rush of triumph, a sense of justice delivered. But as she looked at Margaret, standing there with hurt and confusion etched into every line of her face, the emotional payoff wasn't what she imagined. Instead of exhilaration, there was a hollow, heavy feeling. She had acted decisively, regained control, but the act of revenge, even measured and deliberate, had consequences she hadn't fully anticipated. Margaret spoke again, her voice quieter now, tinged with vulnerability. "Emma, I didn't mean to hurt you. I was only trying to help. I thought you would understand. There was an odd sincerity, but it was too late. Emma had already drawn her line. She realized that Margaret may never fully understand the depth of the violation, may never acknowledge the years of subtle control and intrusion that had led to this. And yet, Emma also recognized that confrontation alone would not undo the betrayal. Words were insufficient. Boundaries had to be enforced. Emma's mind raced as she weighed her options. She could give in, hand over the key, and restore the status quo. It would end the tension immediately, soothe Daniel, and perhaps maintain family peace. But it would also undermine every action she had taken, every boundary she had asserted, every ounce of strength she had summoned to reclaim her home. It would be a hollow victory, a return to passivity. She could not do it. No, she said quietly, her voice steady and unyielding. The word landed like a final strike. Margaret's eyes widened, and for the first time, Emma noticed the flicker of hurt that mirrored her own from weeks before. The silence stretched between them, heavy and charged. Margaret said nothing more, turning slowly on her heel and walking down the driveway. Each step echoed with the weight of years of unspoken tension, the unacknowledged boundaries, and the inevitability of Emma's assertion of control. Daniel remained inside, silent, his face a mixture of admiration, concern, and sadness. Emma walked back into the house and closed the door gently behind her. She didn't feel victorious. The moment she had imagined for so long had passed, and it had left her with a mixture of relief and emptiness. She had reclaimed her home. She had asserted her autonomy. But revenge, even when carefully planned and deliberate, carried its own cost. In the following days, Margaret's calls and messages grew more frequent, tinged with confusion and subtle pleading. Emma remained calm, responding only when necessary, never yielding to pressure. She realized that the power of boundaries was not in the locks themselves, but in her unwavering commitment to enforce them. Each refusal, each moment of patience and steadiness, reinforced her authority, not through anger, but through quiet, controlled action. At the same time, Emma felt the emotional complexity of her choice. She had acted to protect herself, to establish her home as her sanctuary, and to reclaim the sense of security that had been violated. But she also knew that this act would have long-term implications. Family dynamics had shifted. Relationships were strained. Daniel's love for both women placed him in a delicate position, and Emma understood the burden of the tension her actions had created. She felt both empowered and burdened, a mix of liberation and responsibility. As she moved through her daily routines, she reflected on the nature of revenge. It was not a simple, satisfying act. It was layered, complex, and often incomplete. Emma realized that the thrill of asserting control was fleeting. The deeper emotional resolution came not from revenge itself, but from the clarity it brought. She had taken control of her life, her home, and her boundaries. She had acted decisively. The rest was a process of adjustment, reflection, and acceptance. Emma also began to consider Margaret's perspective. The woman had acted from a sense of entitlement, perhaps even care, but without consideration for Emma's autonomy. Emma recognized that Margaret's actions, while unjust, were not purely malicious. Understanding this allowed her to temper her own feelings with empathy, without compromising her boundaries. It was a difficult balance, but necessary for her own peace of mind. Weeks passed, and life slowly settled into a new rhythm. Margaret's presence in their lives diminished, replaced by tentative communication that respected Emma's boundaries. Daniel supported his wife, though he occasionally expressed regret for the strain between his mother and them. Emma accepted that relationships could not always be preserved in their previous form. She had acted to protect her home and herself. And while it had consequences, she understood that the cost was part of reclaiming her autonomy. In quiet moments, Emma reflected on what she had learned. Revenge had given her the means to enforce boundaries, but it did not deliver satisfaction in the way she had imagined. Instead, it provided clarity, a sense of control, and the ability to protect herself. She realized that healing and empowerment came not from retaliation, but from asserting her rights and maintaining her principles. The locks on the door were a symbol of that empowerment, but the true victory lay in her ability to stand firm, to act decisively, and to maintain her dignity. Emma's life continued, marked by a new awareness of her own strength. She had faced a profound violation of trust and responded with deliberate, controlled action. The confrontation with Margaret had tested her resolve, challenged her morality, and forced her to make a choice between appeasement and assertion. In choosing the latter, she had taken ownership of her life and her space, accepting the consequences that came with it. The final lesson settled slowly into her consciousness. Revenge, even when justified, is not about triumph or satisfaction. It is about reclaiming agency, establishing boundaries, and asserting one's right to safety and respect. Emma,